So welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar. This is the second in a three-part series about the institutional market and selling to the institutional market. Some of the materials that Jesse, who will introduce in a minute, will be going over today are based on a program that was developed several years ago between NCAT, the USDA, and the National Farm to School Network. It's called Bringing the Farm to School Agriculture Producers Training. So I'm going to turn it over to Jessie Wright from UNH Cooperative Extension. She's a specialist in farm business planning.
Thanks, Stacey. Happy to be here. All right, let me do the technology thing and share my screen and hope that all goes well. I'll go here, and then that Zoom sidebar just like always knows how to get in the way. I go here, and how's that looking, everybody? Can you see my wonderful peaches? Should I sell the school? Okay, yes. Great. Thanks, Stacey. Okay, so bring back this over here and get started. So the first thing, I think I started this a little bit, but the first thing I like to do is try and figure out who is here, and that helps just understand what we can learn from each other. I'm a big proponent of not being a sage on the stage. These kind of presentations are wonderful because we get to share tips and tricks, but also have tons to learn from each other. It sounds like we have lots of people from around the country, and I love that we'll be able to lean on everyone's experience. We also need to collect some demographic data. So there's a QR code on the screen, or I think Steve just put the link in the chat. Hopefully that'll work. Yep, that brings that up. Great. If you can take a couple of minutes to just fill out those couple questions. The survey data is used to collect demographic data from individuals interacting with UNH Extension. It's really important to our university and our organization that we're reaching a diversity of audiences in our state. And we look at this demographic data in aggregate to see if there are any gaps in who we're reaching with our services. So if you can take a few minutes and do that, that would be great. Okay, looks like people maybe have stopped clicking around, so that's great. We'll keep going here. If you logged on just a second or two after we started messaging in the chat, we talked a little bit about why people are here. Seems like there's lots of folks interested in supporting the farm to school connection, which I love. And Stacey has been a huge champion of that here in New Hampshire, and I'm happy to help today. Let's see. When I talk with farmers or other ag service providers about record keeping, farm finances, pricing, enterprise budgets, I do my very best to not put people to sleep because, you know, fancy Excel sheets aren't the most vibrant of topics, but I also try to get everyone in a mindset that it's much less pressure than sometimes we can put on these financial decisions. So I just want to take a second here before we get started to get us all on the same page about these kind of data-driven sales channel pricing decision-making endeavors that we have to do when we're talking about farm to school. When Stacey asked me to help work on this presentation, I was super excited, and not just because I love to look at geeky spreadsheets, though I do. I'm excited because this isn't really about farm to school or institutional sales. And for those of you who are confused, I promise you are in the right place. Just bear with me for a second. I'm excited to be here mostly because this conversation is all about data-based, data-driven decision making. We use data to inform our decisions all of the time, right? Should I wear a jacket? Well, is it raining outside? Should I make steak for dinner? Do I have steak in the fridge? Do I like steak? Am I in the mood for steak? We don't even think about the data points that we survey in our heads when we're making those decisions, but they're all kind of there. And there's a long list of data points we can pull from to help inform those decisions in even bigger decisions like, should we sell to a school, an institution? Is it right for my farm? This photo here is from my first round of starts from this year. We talked a little bit earlier, Caitlin was mentioning we had kind of a crazy weather weekend. So spent some time inside when the beautiful snow turned to rain. And I'll preface this whole thing with the fact that a reminder that I'm a county field specialist, but I'm on the ag business team, so production is not necessarily my strong suit. My thumb is like barely light green, and so my garden is much more about therapy than about food production. But while I was thinking about what to plant this year over the weekend, I definitely had to mentally collect some data. I moved last year, so I have a much smaller growing space, and I'm not really sure like how much sun the area is gonna get or what the soil is like. But I know that I have some favorite crops to grow. I love tomatoes and Brussels and certain flowers like eucalyptus, even though I really stink at starting those from seed. So if anyone has tips, you can put those in the chat. I just saw Bob's comment about bandwidth. I hope it's not me, but let me know if other folks are having a hard time with hearing. And I'm gonna close that chat just so I don't get distracted because I'm like a squirrel sometimes. Okay, so we were talking about my seeds in my garden, and anyways, my point here is that we have an infinite amount of data points that we can pull from. When I think about starting my seeds this weekend, I could have gone out and used the sun chart and figured out how much sun that area is gonna get all summer long. And I could have taken a soil test and brought it to the UNH lab and like figured out exactly what amendments I was gonna have to put on. But I just made a good guess. Like I looked at where the sun was and how close the barn is, and like, yeah, that sounds good. And ultimately, my driving data was going through my packet, like a box of old seeds from last year. And that's what I planted. That's what I started. There was no cost to me, and I didn't have to go out in the rain. So bear with me here, stay with me. It's definitely not advice on how farmers should start seeds or do crop planting, obviously. But my point is that in the sales channel and pricing decisions conversations that we're having today, we're going to have a whole bunch of data points to inform us. And in my work with farmers, I find that especially when these decisions have monetary implications, data analysis can be so overwhelming, right? It's like, do I have the right cost written down from last year for seeds, and how many seeds do I need for this 36 by 96 high tunnel? And sometimes we get so overwhelmed with that minute details that we just stop doing it. We get into like decision paralysis, right? And it's my hope that we can work together on some questions and kind of ferreting out which things are important and avoid some of that decision paralysis. Just start working through rough numbers to see if it's going to work for you. The plan is we're going to go through some templates for enterprise budgets, and yeah, just keep in mind that sometimes a well-educated guess, maybe this plot of land is going to get 6 hours of sunlight, is better than not doing it because you don't know if it's 127 minutes or 129 minutes. You know, we don't need to lose sleep over that. Okay, and lastly, just on mindset stuff, I'm going to ask for a bunch of participation today. I know we have tons of experience in the room, some growers from across the country, ag service providers. I want to lift up all that experience and invite you to share it with others tonight. We know that we learn best when we're actively participating. And so please feel free, unmute yourself, raise your hand, put in the chat, chime in when we can so we can learn from everybody in the room. Okay. So when we think about farm to school, and when I was going through that packet that Stacy's was talking about earlier, it talks a lot about market channels, channel analysis. And I feel like it's really important to just start with some definitions so we're all on the same kind of starting page. When we're talking about market channels, we talk basically, it's just the path that the goods, whatever you're producing, takes to get from you, the producer, to the end consumer, the eater, the grower to the eater. How is it getting there? And the packet that we were talking about earlier, the Farm to School Producers Workbook, which I think, Stacy, you'll get a copy of later, talks a lot about these market channels for selling to schools. And I know that's kind of a stinky picture, so sorry about the quality there, but they talk about three kind of distinct ways that producers are selling to schools. So the first through kind of this wholesale national distributor, as well as intermediated market channels, and then directly to the school. There's some great stuff in that producer workbook. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about it because you'll be able to work through it on your own. I think we'll focus today on this middle direct to school area, just for simplicity's sake, and because I think next week Caitlin is going to talk about intermediated markets. So we'll leave those questions for next week and or you to peruse the workbook on your own. So we'll focus on this direct to school, this middle pink box here. School districts, collective purchasing cooperatives, and buying groups. So what do we know about the farm to school, direct to school market channel? For the farmers in the room, maybe you're participating in that market channel already. Maybe ag service providers, what have you seen? When I ask for factors, maybe it's like benefit, like a pros and cons list. I was kind of thinking, what do we know about working with farm to school? I should open the chat again, but there were a pretty small group, so feel free to come off mic. Kayla, delivery logistics with schools. Yeah. That's a really important factor. Can you say any more about that? Like, what are the things to think about?
Thinking about when you're working with a school and if you're doing direct purchasing relationships, just delivery is a pretty big thing to consider. Like, are you able to deliver to the school? Is the school have somebody that can come pick it up? Just thinking about that logistic is pretty important when working with a school market. Yeah. And even one level deeper, right? Like timing of delivery. Where does that have to go? During the day, during the morning? Is it afternoon? You know? Yeah, like, are you delivering straight to the kitchen, or do you have to go to the front office and get, so exactly. All that is good to work out.
Yeah. Tammy?
Yeah, I'd say on the pro side is just predictability of quantities and product and price. And
yeah, I think I don't know too much about the predictability of price, but I can imagine that depending on which kids are going to eat lunch at school that week, your menu might change and the quantities of products might change. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
I mean, I think in the direct to school piece, I think most of the schools are, you know, they have those agreements arranged ahead of the season, and so
Okay.
that can be a plus for farmers, so they know how much they intend to be producing
I
based
see what you're
on that
saying.
agreement, and the same goes for the price. Yeah.
I see what you're saying. You're putting it on the pros list. I was trying to roll with that being a con, and I'm glad
No, I think I
I'm
said
glad you
that was on
corrected
the
me.
pros list. Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. You
So
did.
definitely on the
It
pros.
was me. Yep. Okay. Let's see. And also in the chat, we have confusion or lack of information on best pricing practices, especially since this can vary so much from operation to operation. Yeah. So do you, I'm not sure, SR, do you think that confusion is on the producer side?
Oh, hi. Yeah, it's Shannon in
Oh.
Connecticut. Yeah, we just hear a lot of farmers say, well, I don't know what to charge. And if it's too, the idea that schools aren't able to pay a good
Yep.
price, even when schools are meeting fairly good prices often. But, and we always encourage just getting to the conversation about it. But I
Yeah.
feel like it'd be great to have, we've been trying to think about how to create sort of a best practices guide for growers. And then also so that food service directors can meet them with like, well, this is what I pay from my, wholesaler. And it's like, that can be a real conversation stopper because what they're getting from like their large distributor, it just kind of is a shutdown. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I love your point about there being this like automatic assumption that the price isn't going to work for everybody, right? Like we come into this conversation thinking like, oh, schools can't pay enough and I can't afford, I'm growing it too expensively. So I love that idea about kind of breaking down that assumption and having the conversation. I did find the farm to school producer workbook very helpful in some of those kind of best practices. So I was happy about that. Also, they usually have a very repetitive and set menu, so that helps. Yeah, I think Pierre, and that's a really great point as well, right? Like there's predictability in demand. That's a little bit what Tammy was talking about earlier. And if you don't grow one of those things or produce one of those things, like, okay, like that's a pretty clear indicator that like maybe my school is never going to buy my kefir product or something like that, Kayla says prices are hard. I always think about some list of market price comparisons, but it can be so variable. I'll definitely look through the workbook. Yeah, I hear that. It's really hard. And what I'm using with a producer in northern New Hampshire is going to be a much different than what Kayla's using in Connecticut. I can't remember. Anyways,
Vermont.
what is it?
Vermont.
Vermont. Right.
Yeah.
We're just gonna, it's so variable based on like even micro regions that it's hard to come up with that list. And so much of it, of whether the relationship between the school and the farm works is based on cost of production, right? Like how much did this apple or this bushel of apples or whatever costs for the farmer to produce, and does that match what the school is able to provide? One interesting part that I was reading about in the farm workbook, the producer workbook, was encouraging the conversation between the food service director and the producer of like, are there any programs that can help get the price up? Which I think comes back to maybe Shannon's point earlier of like, okay, what is your floor? Are there other programs that we can kind of help bridge that gap between my lowest price and your highest? Okay, so thanks for participating. I really appreciate that. And just this is the market channel assessment worksheet. Again, not the best photo, but you'll be able to check this out. I wanted to bring your attention to it. This has a kind of list of the criteria. It's a pros and cons list, really, right? Like this has direct to school, intermediate, and wholesale, those kind of three branches of the farm to school market channel. But this could very easily also be direct to school, restaurant wholesale, and farmers market, right? We start to, when we're thinking about a decision, a market channel decision, we start to weigh these pros and cons that we're talking about: profit margins, time investment, equipment, packaging and infrastructure, insurance, certification requirements, time spent marketing. You're going to have pluses and minuses for this market channel and others that can help that decision making. I think it would be a really robust webinar to go through each one of these and try and help individual farmers create these decisions, these kind of weighted factors for each of these market channels. But I knew that we didn't have time for that today. And so the one thing that I think I hear most, and you all are confirming that with conversations that you're bringing up today, is like price is kind of the driving factor that most folks are either concerned about, or there's confusion about, or there's just not enough information about. And so I decided that we were gonna stick with the bottom line today. And I think that is rightly listed as this first profit margins line. So let me just check that chat again. Tammy, page 25. Yep. Okay. So we should be going through all of these again rows when we're thinking about a new market channel, gathering those pieces of data to inform the decision. But really kind of it comes down to the bottom line, and hopefully we don't get into decision paralysis around this, and hopefully we can all help farms as ag service providers figure out if the farm to school price, the price that the school is offering matches the farm's bottom line. Okay. So I was thinking that I'm going to open up my template for enterprise budgets, and we're going to walk through together filling out an enterprise budget that could be specific to a crop for farm to school. Does that sound good to everyone? Okay. Over here. Okay, so I know that not everyone is from the Northeast. I typically, what I understand about farm to school purchases is they can kind of be in a pretty distinct category of products. Is that true for other parts of the country as well? Like, what's going on out there in Montana?
What do you mean by like what?
So, okay, yeah, I can be more clear. So really common farm to school purchases like apples, potatoes, carrots, lettuce, either storage crops or quick, easy crops that are available in those shoulder seasons that also match up with the school season, right? Stacey.
Yeah, I mean, Kayla is right. I mean, beef to school is really big here in Montana, and we have like actually a really great program here where we have a toolkit for folks to sell beef to school. But also another thing we have here is Harvest of the Month. So those products with participating schools, anywhere from like winter squash and carrots and greens and lentils is another thing here. So yeah, so a lot of, that's kind of the entry point for schools and producers. And, yeah, and then, but yeah, we're also a northern climate, so
Mm.
probably really similar to what is going on in New Hampshire.
Yeah. Although
terms of crop.
I would venture to guess much less beef. We have much less beef here. I did see that amazing video from Food Corps. I'll link it later, but there's a great beef to school video from, I think it's Food Corps, that I was poking at earlier. Okay. So. Okay. Is that looking like a Google Sheet? Great. I'm gonna pull this up. So this is a template that was developed originally through many grant funding opportunities by a colleague and friend, Faith Gilbert. We've kind of adopted them into UNH for our new farmer school and changed things around. And I think it's a really great way, especially for new farmers, those of you who are ag service providers who are working with new farmers, to try out the economics of farm to school and see if it's going to be worthwhile. Some of these pricing decisions or enterprise budgets, again, can be really overwhelming if you don't have years of price of expenses and actual data to pull from when you're working on your enterprise budgets. So what we've tried to do here is create a system that is like pretty low entry for folks who don't have that historical data. I'm not going to run through all these tabs on the bottom, but suffice it to say that these kind of budget and actuals columns are all fed in by individual enterprise budgets. And I think we should run through one of these enterprise budgets, figuring out how a farmer would start to set them up for a farm to school enterprise, specific enterprise budget. I feel like spinach is probably a good way to start around here. Lots of folks growing spinach in high tunnels, and so it has like a pretty long production season that matches farm to school season. And the general overview, let me see if I can make this a little bigger too. View. Hopefully that's a little better for you. So we're going to talk about our production area, and then we're going to talk about sales. We're going to talk about expenses and labor, and hopefully get down to a per unit cost of production so that we can take that and it brings us to a price that we might be able to get to for farm to school purchases. So let's see, anybody growing spinach in the room, or any other like high tunnel green? Okay, well, we have, let's say we have one bed. Okay, we'll call this one bed because that's pretty like low entry. Okay, we have one bed in production, and then a pretty standard yield for this side of the country, at least this portion of the country, is 280.
280 what?
Oh, sorry, 280 pounds. So if you have a 3 by 96 bed, probably 40 pounds per bed per harvest. And so like baseline projection that I put in here when I was filling out this sample was 1 pound per square foot as a reasonable estimate. So this could be an entire acre. And some of these other budgets, we could maybe run through one that's beef, though that's slightly more complicated with a, anyways, okay, let me stay focused. We've got a 96 foot long bed that's 3 feet wide, 9 plants per square foot. That spinach is started in like early September. It's transplanted in late September. We've got 7 harvests throughout the growing season. And this is all probably gobbledygook because it's not written down. But suffice it to say, we've got 288 pounds for that one bed that we're talking about. Now, what I like about this budget is you can say like, oh, but really I have like 4 beds in that high tunnel. And it's going to continue to bring that yield down and do some automatic conversions for you, equations for you, so that you can really use this as a tool to play, as well as, you know, build another one for record keeping. Okay, so whenever I'm looking to crunch some numbers on enterprise budgets, I kind of use these Excel or Google Sheets. We can quickly get down to that cost of production that I was talking about earlier. A couple things that I want to point out before we get to the sales data here. We're going to enter some expenses. These expenses are all direct expenses, right? They're direct costs. So costs that are going to be directly linked with spinach production. This isn't my freezer utility bill or farm liability insurance, but rather things that if you stopped growing spinach, and specifically in this example, we're just going to put in spinach for the school, SAU 9 spinach, right? To really help us get a better picture of the costs associated with growing for the school. The other thing that I wanted to say is, in particular to these templates, these expenses are totally customizable, right? So what I have in here now is just some common crop expenses. If a grower or you as a farmer didn't see what you needed, or you knew that you needed to add some stuff in for specific to farm to school, right? Like, oh no, this school wants really specific, I don't know, XYZ labels. They want like really specific XYZ labels on this spinach. So we need to add that in. Totally doable on this this template. Okay, this is where I need some help from you all. Although we didn't have any spinach growers in the room, so we might have to go with the numbers that I put in here as example. What do you think some reasonable numbers are for sales for the school? So I've put in the expenses in here that are going to be associated with this one bed of spinach. And I have no idea how much a school would buy. And so Stacy can help, or maybe some of the other ag service providers in the room. How much spinach do you think that like a school would even buy from someone?
Well, kind of depends on how many kids they're feeding,
Mm-hmm.
where they're using the spinach.
Mm-hmm.
Salad bar, or is it part of the reimbursable meal? So
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could just probably put in 100 pounds a month.
100 pounds a month. That's great. And what are some of the requirements that the school might ask about that spinach? Do you think that it has to come in washed, or is in a certain kind of pound package?
They probably would like it to be washed.
Cool.
And I think right now, I think they're probably getting baby spinach in the, I don't know what size, are they 5-pound boxes maybe?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Okay. Cool. So we have our one bed in production, and then we have a 280-pound yield for that. And in this section, we're having farmers project how much of each item is going to be sold by each market channel. And so you could do retail, wholesale. We're going to change this one to farm to school. And when Stacy showed me this list earlier of spinach, baby organic, $21.77 for a quarter pound. So we know that a wholesale price per pound would be 21.7 times 4. So that's a quarter pound.
They're probably not buying organic spinach.
Oh, okay. So it just happens to be on the list.
Yeah.
Okay. So a better price would be
The baby spinach 4-pound package. Or
that seems like a much more reasonable price that they would go after. $15.02 for 4 pounds. Okay, so 15.02 for 4 pounds instead. What we'll have to do is equals 15.02 divided by 4. Okay, so now we know that the wholesale price that that school district is offering is $3.76 per pound. And we're producing 280 pounds. Assuming that we're selling 100% of those 280 pounds, we're going to make $1,000 off that spinach. We enter in some data here about seeds and plants, fertilizers, growing supplies, again, all direct costs, right? So we're not talking about those kind of liability insurance, delivery, yada yadas. You've got a total input cost of 122. Now we get down to this labor section. It's important to note here that we're going to put in here is hours worked, and then the hourly rate here, not a rate in here about the time, right? And so we can assume that we're going to do maybe 3 hours of greenhouse seeding, maybe, yeah, we'll just copy over these. These are time estimates for how much each of those would take. And that's throughout the whole season, right? And so if I have 7 plantings, 7 seedings, where these are all kind of multiples of 7. 7, you can see the math here, right? 7 harvest, 40 pounds per harvest, 20 pounds, I can wash 20 pounds an hour. And so that gets us to 14. Really simple kind of back of the napkins situation here where we're like, how much time will it take me to wash a bag of spinach? I don't know. Like, let me try one. I do kind of a time trial and I wash a pound of spinach and then I multiply it by however many times I'm going to make that delivery to the school, right? And I think this part is really important where I see farms kind of getting stuck in what I was talking about earlier with the, like, what if it's 72 minutes instead of 60? And, it's okay. We're like, just going to put our best guess in. And then if it's different next year, or if it's actually different when we're doing our records for the season, great. Now we have more information. Now we have more data points. So 61 hours, total labor hours after you kind of go through all these guesses. You've got 15, you're paying $15 an hour. And so that brings kind of a labor rate of $1,000. So now we've got $120, $22 in direct expenses. We've got almost $1,000 in labor. So that's our total expenses of $1,031. We've brought in $1,051. And this all kind of does the math here for a gross margin of $22, which feels kind of sad and maybe not worth it, right? And so a farmer would say like, oh man, that price that you're offering me, food service director, like it's not really worth my time, right? We know that these expenses have given us a production cost per sales unit of $368. So a grower can, this is all of the expenses divided by the amount of units sold. So now a grower can say like, okay, well, what happens if I can plant twice as much spinach and sell twice as much by like adding another school district or offering even more to the same school district? I can go back up here and say, I've got 2 beds in production and my yield per bed is still going to be 280. What does that do to my production cost per sales unit? Like, okay, now we're talking. Now, like $1,000 is maybe in gross margin. Do folks feel like this would be a useful process when thinking through the kind of farm to school decision making? Let me check this chat, see where we're at. I guess let me rephrase my question. Are farmers already doing this in a different way so that they're understanding the farm, like if their prices match production cost?
In Vermont, NOFA, which is the organization that I work, the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont, we have a farmer services team that does cost of production and financials with farms, but that's like on a, like, not volunteer base, but like they sign up for that program.
Opt-in, totally.
Opt-in, yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know on an individual level for the farms that I'm working with, we don't go into this level of detail when thinking about selling to institutions, so I could see how collaborating across those programs might be helpful in using a tool like this.
Other folks? I can say I'm asking this question because I would say that probably 87% of the farmers I work with will, if I said to them, can you tell me your cost of production on this pound of spinach? They would say like, yeah, I mean, I kind of know. Or it's like a resounding yes, but like, oh, we did the calculation years ago, or like, oh no, it's fine. We like to sell to the school. It's part of our value system. And so like, it doesn't really matter if we're losing money in it or not. And like, that's okay. However folks want to run their businesses, it's awesome. What I would love is for farms to know there's like it didn't really take us that long to do that, right? We've been together for almost an hour. I had some of this pre-filled already so we didn't have to think through how long it would take to clear and cover crop one high tunnel. But if we take some of the pressure off of like getting everything totally correct based on last year's data or like projected revenue numbers or delivery fees, we can start to get to this point where this $1.84 number is really helpful in having those farm to school conversations, right? Like that becomes now a floor that I know I can't go below as a farmer. Another thing that I run into a lot that I'll say, because we have a lot of ag service providers here, this labor section is it's a 90% of the farmers that I work with tell me like, oh, like, don't worry about that. I own the business. I don't pay myself. I don't pay myself a wage. So like, just put in zeros. And it's not, again, not my job to throw shade. I'd rather shine the light on the benefit of putting in some labor hours into here. What I mean is, I just want to point out that labor is, we know, the most expensive input on a small diversified farm. Maybe not the same out in Montana on a cattle ranch, but bear with me for the example. If you don't account for those labor hours, even if it's paid in cash, you're never going to get a full picture of what your cost of production is, right? So if I clear all of this out, like was in here before, let me see. Now my production cost per sales unit is 22 cents a pound. Heck yeah, even when if we do one bed in production, now I'm like, oh yeah, like I'm making money, $929. But the reality is that as soon as you have to pay someone or want to expand to have an employee, and you've been selling to this school at a lower rate than you really kind of should be, you're not able to increase that anymore. And let me give it an example because I'm not being articulate about this at the moment. There's a farmer that I know who is on the border of New Hampshire and Vermont, and he has pastured sheep, right? So he fell and broke his leg last year, and he already had all of his sheep sold, so he really couldn't be like, oh, well, like, I'll just figure it out. For 4 months, he couldn't move fence to rotate his pastures, right? So he had to pay someone to do it. And we were talking this summer, and he was so bummed that he had already pre-sold all of his animals and taken deposits at a rate that did not include labor. As soon as he went in and added these kind of labor hours of paying someone at $15 an hour to do all these tasks, he was losing money on every single pound, half, and whole that he sold. And so I know that's kind of an extreme example, but I really do encourage farms when I'm working with them, and hope that you all, when you're working with farmers, can have folks work through these labor hours and add them in so that they can figure out a cost of production that is reflective of either paying employees or hopefully earning themselves a living wage at some point in their farm career, farm business career. Okay. So the last thing I want to say about this is enterprise budgets are wonderful. They can give us a really good picture about what an individual market channel or crop or, again, enterprise is going to do for our business. And in this expenses section, we've taken into account all of those direct costs that are associated with growing that spinach. But what we want to look at as a whole for a farm is really so much more than that. When we take a look at this if I was working with a farm who was considering farm to school, I would do this spinach budget with them, trying to chronicle all of those income and expenses that are directly related. And then I would bring that back to a whole farm budget that then included all of those overhead expenses that we know are existing for farms. It's important that not only does the decision to sell to the school make money, but also like give money back to the so that the farm can pay its overhead expenses. I think that's all I'm going to say about that because it's enough. It's enough of budgets and numbers and stuff. And maybe I will stop sharing and just like see how that landed with folks. Did it feel like it's really hard to look at somebody else's spreadsheet on a webinar? And so thanks for bearing with me. And like, did it feel like going through a spreadsheet like this, or even a list of costs versus revenues to find a price would be helpful for a farm who is thinking about buying from a school?
This is Blake. I know I hadn't said much of anything up
Oh,
until
hey, Blake.
now.
That's okay.
Do you see a good number of some districts actually providing some templates that give a good deal more guidance? Because I know that with some of the larger school districts where there's this huge industry in of itself, just in the procurement, much less in the distribution and the processing of food. But what are some of those key negotiating elements as far as within that RFP process or whatever process is used to evaluate new vendors?
Yeah, that's probably a good question for Stacy. She understands the kind of farm to school in New Hampshire environment a lot better than I do. Stacy, anything come to mind there?
I think for the schools that want to buy local, they will find a way to do that. I mean, price certainly does play a role, but I think some of them are willing and able to pay more than, say, the conventionally distributed food price. Because in general, local food here is just a little more expensive than food from Florida and California. So they have to want to make that choice to buy local food, and some of them do and some of them don't. And then thus the challenge of, farm to school. I think farmers could have other luck with other types of institutions that might not have the strict, a little bit of money that schools have. They might have a little bit more money to buy from local farms. But yeah, it's always been a real tough nut to crack of how do we actually get, locally grown food into our schools at a price, prices they can afford. And, we have, when I first started in farm to school, we didn't have any food hubs. We do now, so that makes it a little bit easier, but then there's the added cost of that marketing and distribution that's tacked on to the food. So it's still, a bit of a juggle. So I don't
Yeah,
have an answer for you, but schools can and do buy local. They still have to be able to afford it. It's still, they've got to get it there, whether it's direct from the farm or through a food hub or some other way. And it's just not, right now it's just not a huge market for our farmers.
Yeah, I know. I'm in Texas, so I mean, it would in West Texas. So I mean, in of itself, that's one aspect of it. But I know that a lot of school districts, when they're already hard systems to navigate in of themselves to find the right set of contacts, because it's not often just one person, as we all know, that makes a call, unless it's a really small district. But most of the big money on the table with the larger school districts, because the money's there, it's just, of course, finding the right audience and then meeting the criteria and also the quantity of
Yeah.
them. So, all right, awesome.
I think one thing that brought up for me is quantifying those kind of pain in the butt factors. And that's there's no elegant way of saying this, so I'm just going to go for it, right? Like if selling to the school is giving you additional agita, additional heartburn, taking more time than say selling to a restaurant or selling to in another market channel, make sure that is represented somewhere in that enterprise budget that we're talking about. We can try and quantify whether it's through labor hours, like, oh, farm to school is actually like there's a ton of red tape and it's actually like 20 more hours a year. We're quantifying that in those labor hours. So at least, you know, on paper, we can see like, yep, pain in the butt factor. That's what we call it. And we might knock off some of that pain in the butt factor because it's part of our value system, right? The thing about these enterprise budgets and getting to that 50 cents or 44 cents per pound of production cost is that just because we have that information doesn't mean our hands are tied to it. I can say like, yeah, like I would make more money selling to Joe's Crab Shack down the street, but like it's part of my farm's value system to sell to the school. And even at this price, I see that it can work on paper. And so I'm going to make that decision, right? All that the budgets do is give us more information to make those decisions, more data points to make those decisions. But what we don't want is farms to like not have that bottom number to work back from. They can put their finger on the scale one way or the other and decide if farm to school is a good decision for them. But not having a starting point, I think, puts farms at a pretty big disadvantage. And it's one way that we're really trying to help farms figure out, like, no matter what market channel it is, like, is this market channel right for you? I'll just bring up one last slide talking about other vendor requirements that like might be a factor in some of this farm to school decision making, and then maybe we can just have a chat about experiences, sticky points, anything like that with the last few minutes. Okay, slideshow. Well, I guess I'll go here and say like, at least there's a gazillion enterprise budgets that you can find online. It's certainly like we didn't create the wheel on this, right? So search for the ones that make good sense to you, but also like if you have farms that want to work in a Google Sheets land that I just showed you, please feel free to give them my contact info and I can help coach them through using that spreadsheet. And then and this is a really text heavy slide. I kind of hate it, but I wanted to just put in some potential other vendor requirements or specifications that a school might have that would impact a decision whether to sell to them or not. And these are all items that probably can be put onto that budget as an additional expense. So post-harvest handling practices, like, are we needing to get GAP certified? Like, there's certainly expenses attached to that GAP certification, as well as labor hours needed to come up with that or other third-party certification programs. Product liability insurance, auto insurance, those are all typically expenses that would go on that whole farm budget sheet and not on an enterprise budget. But when we're thinking about selling to a school that requires additional insurance, we want to make sure that cost is baked into the specific enterprise budget for that spinach, right? Yeah, you can see all the other ones on here. Again, I didn't make this up. This came from the Farm to School Producers Guidebook workbook. And so lots of great info in there to dig through. I think this payment system one is really interesting. Again, we talked about red tape, but if my farm is really small and does not cash flow on a 90-day terms, let me back up some of that jargon. Sorry about that. If my farm needs the money for that spinach every week in order to buy new items for the next week, a school that's not going to pay me for 100 days, it's not going to be a good decision for my farm. I'm not going to be able to replant each time I need to harvest if I don't have the cash to buy new supplies. So that lag time and payment schedule, I think, is pretty important, especially when talking about big ticket items like beef that Tammy was talking about out in Montana, or other small farms that don't have cash flow to fall back on, or operating loans. And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing and like invite folks, like, what other stuff have you seen be either pitfalls or unexpected costs associated, or reasons why folks maybe were disappointed in Farm to School or really excited about Farm to School?
I would like to just mention that in those labor costs, that like distribution component would be a really important piece. If your school is asking you to, you know, a school district food service manager wants you to, you know, deliver to all 4 schools, you know, once a week, you know, those,
Totally.
yeah, those things need to be put into the equation. I think that was one of the things that stood out on that labor component.
Yeah. Delivery, and I know lots of folks are doing some minimal processing, right? Like, it didn't touch on that, but if you're slicing things in a way that you're not typically for other market channels, how do we quantify that in both labor hours and that pain in the butt factor?
Yeah, I'll just build off of that too, with as far as considering working with a hub versus direct sale. And we'll touch upon this way more next week too. Just again, you know, I think there is a sticker shock factor sometimes working with food hubs of like, they need to mark up 30 to 35%, but it's because they are accounting for their labor that goes into the sales, right? The distribution, the refrigerated distribution, the storage, the marketing, the phone calls, the hand holding that they're doing for those relationships so that you don't have to. There's a cost associated with that. And on the flip side of that, if you then choose to have a direct relationship and it's your phone calls and it's your refrigerated truck or Subaru with a cooler in the back, you know, it's these materials and your time that do add up. So just making sure that that labor is reflected, whether it's through, you know, the value of working through a food hub, or if you're choosing to take those things on yourself. And then just a couple of other things too, is that there's been some success stories. You know, it's often where local product is more expensive, but there are these success stories every now and then, especially when it comes to greens, things that don't last long. It can be an easier sell to schools when they are getting big boxes of California far away. Often they're saying they're picking through and sometimes composting up to half of every box. So when they are paying a slightly higher price for local, but able to use all of it, they're actually able to sometimes figure out that it's a cost savings to them. And lastly, I'll just say that, you know, there can be a value to regular sales. So if you were to get a school to say, you know, we'll take 20 pounds a week for 8 weeks, what is the value to you, rather than is your alternative market, you know, a farmer's market where you don't actually know if you're going to sell that 20 pounds on a given week. And because of that, are you able to be a little bit more flexible on price?
Yeah, all awesome thoughts. Thanks, Caitlin. I love that. And I love, I think for those of us who are ag service providers, like having those conversations with producers, right? Like how do we talk to a food service director about, having a sign up that tells the students where their lettuce is coming from this week, or doing a mailer that goes out to parents and the weekly newsletter about that, so that there's those added benefits of like, what is the marketing cost that I'm saving there if I don't have to put out that ad on my own? Yeah, there's all kinds of creative additions to this. Other thoughts?
I just wanted to mention one other thing about like, because there's a lot in the cons aisle, right? But I think, the, I think there's just certain crops that lend really well to selling to schools. And if I've learned anything from this Bringing the Farm to School project, is like, some of those crops might end up penciling out to be more profitable by selling to schools, even with a lower price point, just because it's, this predictable same amount that doesn't require a ton of labor.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I keep wanting to drive that point home, because I think, selling to schools and only schools might not be the best and most profitable approach to, your marketing strategy, but it's like one of a few different strategies to help you diversify and, spread out risk.
Yeah. It's part of the reason why we keep on that spreadsheet. That sales section had retail, wholesale, CSA, right? Like, because a mix is always best, right, for risk management, but also we can start to play around with that number. Okay, well, what if I did get rid of a farmer's market? Look at how much my labor hours would go down. And am I at that same number? The ability for a spreadsheet like that to be dynamic and make those kind of changes where you're like, okay, what happens if, and you're doing that in that planning process and market channel selection, I think is really where the power comes from. And we at least here we know that farmers markets are the biggest time sink and often the least profitable market channel around because of the time sink. But when farmers say, oh, I don't pay myself, so it's fine. Again, we start to get into that. Like, okay, well, you're kind of skewing the numbers then, right? And that's fine. That's totally your decision to make. I'm taking up too much air. Anybody else have other thoughts on farm to school? And before I digress us into farmers markets? Really just one small piece of this decision making, right? Like, I always laugh about these webinars because there are so many awesome things to talk about. Like, we could talk about relationships and gap certification and payment systems and distribution logistics. And like, is all of those things are important when we think about, is farm to school right for me? But I don't think we can get away from the cost of production, and the more we can do to help farmers better understand their costs of production and keep going back year after year to say, great, what numbers do I know were different than my last best guess? I'm looking at my records from this year and I see, like, actually, I did some time trials and this task took me much longer. Or, oh, the price for those bags the school wants went up or down or whatever. Just really encouraging farms to get some numbers on paper and then keep going back to it year after year to see, like, is this still working for me? Do I need to go back to the farm to school director or the food service director to say, like, where can we make some changes? And thank goodness we have Stacy to help us with all that.
No, I am not the expert in any farm business planning. The farmer school. Now you're doing some of this in the farmer school?
Yeah, we have, well, at UNH, we have a 16-week new farmer school that's annual. And it's a mix of online and in person, but it covers both production and business topics. As kind of like a 101, I kind of want to start a farm, but I'm not sure if it makes sense. So we touch a lot on enterprise budgets and making those choices, sketching everything out before you decide to buy 20 acres in Whitefield, trying to make the planning process a little bit easier and accessible.
And so your services are also available for farmers to reach out to you to maybe help
Definitely.
them through this if they wanted?
Definitely. So, for anyone here or folks who might know farmers who want to work through this kind of scheduling or budgeting, I don't have this available online as a template, but that's only because it can be really discouraging to start and say like, oh, this is so great, and then like write over formulas and like this does not working how it's supposed to be working, right? So what I would like to do is meet with someone one-on-one, kind of customize it a little bit for them, and then really set them up for success to use on their own. But that just doesn't happen if it's a template like downloadable online. So I do have like reach out to me and I'll get you started. But I can put my email in the chat and anybody can send folks to me, especially this time of year because we are coming up on slow season for me.
Oh, so we have some folks from other states. Can
Mhm.
do other university extension programs also offer this service?
Yeah, often their land grant university extensions have ag business people. I don't know what that looks like in terms of diversified enterprise budgeting for each state, but if somebody went to like Montana Extension and said like, can somebody help me on this, and there was nobody, I would help anybody no matter what state if it wasn't available in your state. Yeah, we don't want to leave anyone behind, but I also don't want to step on another extension's toes, if that makes sense.
Any final questions, comments? Well, thanks everybody, and thanks Jesse for walking us through that. So this is being recorded. It'll be available on the New Hampshire Farm to School website. You can find the link to the producer trainings there and the webinar last week and this one. And then the next week's webinar with Caitlin is presenting about food hubs as well as some information about the transition to organic project will be within that webinar as well. So if you're interested in learning how to sell through food hubs and about organic transition, please register and tune into that. So next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And with that,
Looking forward to it.
thank you, everyone.